Huìnéng asked Hui Ming, without thinking of good or evil, "Show me your original face, before your mother and father were born." Hello and welcome to a new type of episode of Wright on Buddhism called the Kōan Series. In the Kōan Series, we will read and discuss famous koans used by real Buddhist monks from such sources as the Blue Cliff Record, the Gateless Gate, the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and many others. Full disclosure, this is not how koans are used or ought to be used in Buddhist practice, but I am here to give some context and extra meaning to some of these koans so that you might see them in a new light and gain some newer, deeper meaning from them than you did before. I hope you enjoy. For more details on the process of koan practice, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism episode 32, What are Koans? And for more on Zen Buddhism, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism episode 10, What is Zen? I will include the links in today's show notes. In short, koans are phrases and questions that are a part of Zen or Chan Buddhist practice. They are often seemingly meaningless or nonsensical phrases or unanswerable questions given to a practitioner by a master to meditate on. The practitioner then commonly strives to observe the phrase or to meditate on a particular unusual sequence of words until they have reached the point of some higher understanding or awakening. This practice is thought to help a practitioner come to a sudden, deep understanding or awakening that's known as satori in Japanese. Think of it like an aha moment on steroids. Today's koan is known in English by the prompt that it gives us. Show me your original face. Unlike previous koans, this one is not typically given to a practitioner early on in their koan practice because the realization of it and the undercurrents in it are subtle and easy to misunderstand. Additionally, it has a lot of background that we ought to discuss here. First and foremost, some of you may know that Huìnéng, one of the characters in this koan, is the sixth patriarch of Chan Buddhism, and his life and teachings are the subject of the Platform Sutra. This is an extremely important text to Zen and Chan Buddhism, which we will read and discuss in its entirety soon. Some of the main themes and topics that come up in it are the direct and unadulterated perception of one's true nature, as well as the unity in essence of morality, meditative practice, and wisdom. In addition to these, it also contains themes of non-duality, particularly between sudden and gradual enlightenment, both of which we will discuss soon. This particular koan is a story associated with Huìnéng that does not come up in the Platform Sutra, but it is important that you remember those themes we mentioned because Huìnéng teaches on them both in the sutra and in this koan. The koan comes to us from the Eiichi Shimomissé translation of the Mumonkan, as it's known in Japanese, or the Wu Men Guan, as it's known in Chinese, or the Gateless Gate, as it's known in English. This text is a compilation of koans that were compiled in the 13th century in China by a Chan master named Wu Men Huikai. Thus, the title of the Gateless Gate is a pun, because you will find that there are commentaries on the cases by a character named Wu Men in Chinese, or Mumon in Japanese. We will talk more about the history of the Gateless Gate later, but for now, I will read the case from which the koan we are discussing today comes. I will offer Chinese and Japanese names for all the characters mentioned. Eino, Huìnéng, the sixth patriarch, was pursued by monk Enmyo, Hui Ming, up to Daiyurei. The patriarch, seeing Enmyo coming, laid the robe and the bowl on a rock, and said to him, "This robe represents the faith. Is it to be fought for by force? You may take them now." Enmyo went to move the bowl and the robe, and yet they were as heavy as mountains. He could not move them. Hesitating and trembling, Enmyo asked the patriarch, "I come for the teaching, not for the robe. Please enlighten me." The patriarch said, "What is primordially Enmyo? If you do not think this is good, nor do you think this is evil." At that moment, Enmyo was greatly awakened. His whole body was covered with sweat. Enmyo cried, bowed, and said, "Is there, or is there not, any other significance than your secret words and teachings a minute ago?" The patriarch answered, "What I have told you is no secret at all. Once you have realized your own true self, the depth rather belongs to you." Enmyo said, "When I was at Obai with the other monks, I never realized what my true self was. Now you have dispersed the clouds of my ignorance to realize it, just like a man capable of discerning warm and cold by tasting water. From now on, you are my teacher." The patriarch said, "We both have Obai for our teacher. Guard your own self." Mumon, or Wu Men, offers his comments on this. "We should say that the sixth patriarch was in an emergency," he writes. This revelation of his, however, resembles the deed of an overly protective grandmother who peeled a fresh lychee, removed its stone, and put it to her grandchild's mouth, ready for him to swallow. You describe it in vain, you picture it to no avail, praising it is useless, Cease to worry about it at all. It is your true self. It has nowhere to hide. Even if the universe is annihilated, it is not destroyed. In order to understand today's koan and Mumon's confusing comments about it, there are some concepts which we have visited on this show before, which we might want to bring up again and discuss, just to establish the background for what might be going on here, and that would be helpful to bring to your own engagement with this koan. As I said, koans are not meant to be understood intellectually, but as a scholar, I think I would like to offer the deeper meanings and contexts that are at play in a given koan so that they're more widely understandable and richly meaningful. The three concepts at play in this koan, as I understand it, that I would like to offer up my expertise in are the concept of the primordial Buddha, non-duality, and the concept of Buddha nature versus original enlightenment. Beginning with the concept of the primordial Buddha, we haven't dealt with this much yet, but we will as we continue our readings and discussions of the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra argues in chapter 16 that the story of the life of the Buddha is not as we thought it was. As we might know by now, the conventional story of the Buddha is that he was a bodhisattva for a number of his past lives. In those lives, he did his bodhisattva work, perfecting the 6 perfections of the bodhisattva. These are generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. This is documented in the Jataka tales, or the stories of the past lives of the Buddha, which we will read and discuss in the future. Then, as is documented in the Buddhacharita, or the story of the life of the Buddha, written by Ashvaghosha in the 2nd century Common Era, the Buddha was born a prince, left the palace to become an ascetic, tried a couple of ascetic practices to no avail, and then sat under the Bodhi tree, vowing not to get up until he defeated suffering and attained enlightenment. After sitting under the tree for 49 days, he attains enlightenment and begins to preach, and the rest is history. The alternate story posed by the Lotus Sutra in chapter 16, which is titled The Immeasurable Lifespan of the Tathagata, argues that Shakyamuni actually became enlightened many millions of eons ago, and that his arising in the world and living out the story documented in the Buddhacharita were all skillful means for teaching and enlightening beings. The fact that this implies that there is one original or primordial Buddha who chooses to manifest himself in the form of the Buddhas Shakyamuni, Amitabha, Vairocana, Ratnasambhava, Prabhutaratna, etc., is incredibly significant. What is more is that the commentaries on this have discussed that there is a likelihood that bodhisattvas, like Avalokiteshvara, Samantabhadra, Mahastamaprapta, Maitreya, Manjushri, and so on, are also manifestations of the primordial Buddha. Other commentaries have even argued that it is impossible to know whether or not anybody in the universe is a hidden Buddha who is arising in the world as a skillful means for teaching and enlightening sentient beings somehow. The commentaries on this vary widely because it is such a controversial paradigm shift in the texts, and many interpretations are defined in a sectarian nature. Zen defines the primordial Buddha as Shakyamuni. Pure Land Buddhism defines the primordial Buddha as Amitabha. Esoteric Buddhism defines the primordial Buddha as Vairocana, and so on. Either way, this is a fascinating way to think about the relationship between the Buddha in history and the Buddhas in the texts. It relies specifically on non-duality as being the nature of the relationship between Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, and all other Buddhas. Keep this in mind as we move into the discussion of how non-duality functions in this koan in particular. There is an original primordial Buddha, some Buddhists say, that is the original one, and he has a non-dualistic relationship, at least with the historical Buddha, at most with everyone in the entire universe. Moving along to the concept of non-duality, we have talked about it on the Kōan series and in the show in the past, but I think that it merits a little bit of discussion in the course of understanding this koan. In fact, we find that non-duality is one of the most important and subtle teachings that ever comes up in koan practice. For more on those concepts, see Bright on Buddhism episode 6, What is the Middle Way? Bright on Buddhism episode 33, What is Emptiness? And the Kōan series episode 2, What is the Sound of One Hand Clapping? I will link these in the show notes. In short, the doctrine of non-duality, or Advaya in Sanskrit, refers to the idea that a dualistic perspective of the world around us is an incomplete and categorically limited view. If we think that X is not Y and Y is not X, we are not expressing the correct understanding of emptiness and impermanence. Judging that X is not Y and Y is not X assumes that X and Y contain some fundamental, independent, and unique existence apart from each other, which is not true due to the doctrines of emptiness and impermanence, and it requires the application of labels and signifiers by our own cognition as a means of defining them against each other, and that arises from delusion and perpetuates delusion. Understanding that, we can talk about how this applies to the koan at hand. Victor Sogen Hori argues that the father and mother portion and the good and evil portion of the koan represents a duality, and thus the original face portion represents the destruction of that duality into a non-dualistic fashion. We have seen this pattern of clearing out before in his interpretations, and I think that that's useful here. He reads the koan as a process. In the example of the one hand clapping, first he interprets that there are two hands clapping, and then there are one, and now zero. In this koan, there is good or evil, there is a mother and father, and then there is the original face. There is a dualism portion, and then those dualities are cleared out, and then the duality collapses into non-duality. Let's keep that in mind as we continue our discussion of Buddha nature and original enlightenment. Moving on then to Buddha nature and original enlightenment. Buddha nature is a very popular doctrine in Mahayana Buddhism, which we have talked about at length before. For more on it, I recommend the Kōan Series Episode 1, Does a Dog Have Buddha Nature? This concept takes on several meanings over time that I laid out in that episode and would like to lay out again here. The earliest iteration of this concept comes from the Tathagata Sutras, a group of Mahayana sutras which teach the idea of the Tathagata. Tathagata is the Sanskrit word which we often translate as Buddha nature, but it has a much richer and more complex meaning that should be first discussed. First, Tathagata is one of the titles in Sanskrit for the Buddha, which means thus become one or thus gone one. It is a title that specifically refers to the present state of the Buddha, known as his tatata, and his either becoming or passing away. If we read it as his passing away, it is referring to how he is the one who has exited samsara and achieved nirvana without any remainder. If we look at it as his becoming, it is referring to his becoming in samsara to save sentient beings. Either way, it refers to the enlightenment of the Buddha. Garbha is a suffix that affords the meaning of containing the Tathagata, or the state of being the womb of the Tathagata. This has also been read to mean the seed, the matrix, the essence, or the embryo of the Tathagata. The Tathagata Sutras teach us that every sentient being is imbued with this womb of the Buddha. The way that it is explained is quite similar to how the possibility of enlightenment has been explained in the past. We have often asked on this show, is it possible for somebody to describe the taste of chocolate to you if you have never tasted it? The only way to fully understand the taste of chocolate is to taste chocolate. This same question is applied to enlightenment. If we have never ever been enlightened before, how do we know what we are reaching for? How can it be explained to us in any sort of meaningful way by the Buddha? And how can it be possible to experience if we don't have any sort of reference to go back to? The answer lies in this Tathagata. This essence of the Buddha that resides in all of us is thought of as a seed that can possibly develop into Buddhahood in the future. It is the memory of the taste of chocolate. This is how it's explained in its earlier iterations, but it evolves over time, as all Buddhist doctrines do. From this discussion, we should move on to the idea of original enlightenment. This is known as Benjue in Chinese and Hongaku in Japanese. This concept has no Sanskrit equivalent because it is entirely an East Asian Mahayana development. It originates in China as a derivative of the Buddha nature doctrine, and it first comes up in the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, known as the Dasheng Qixin Lun in Chinese, or the Daizhou Kishin Ron in Japanese. The argument is that if we do indeed have this inherent Buddha nature as part of us from our very first arising in this universe, then that implies that we are originally enlightened, and our delusions lead to us forgetting or losing our knowledge of this. The next step then is naturally that we should have to meditate, to do good works, to practice, to regain and re-realize this original enlightenment. The Chan and Zen Buddhists often use the analogy of a mirror. Our original state is that of a polished mirror that reflects reality exactly as it is. But over time, this mirror becomes dusty and dirty, and we have to polish the mirror over and over again. This doctrine comes up in Zen and Chan commentaries on this koan as well. Mumon or Wu Men writes, "You cannot describe it or draw it. You cannot praise it enough or perceive it. No place can be found in which to put the original face. It does not disappear even when the universe is destroyed." Zen Master Daito writes, "Sweep away thoughts means one must do zazen. Once thoughts are quieted, the original face appears. Thoughts can be compared to clouds. When clouds vanish, the moon appears. The moon of suchness is the original face. Thoughts are also like the fogging of a mirror. When you wipe away all condensation, a mirror reflects clearly. Quiet your thoughts and behold your original face before you were born." Zen Master Dogen writes, "Cease practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech. Learn the backward step that turns your light inward to illuminate within. Body and mind of themselves will drop away and your original face will be manifest." Putting all of this together, I would like to offer an analysis of this koan that is based on the concepts that I've just explained. When you keep them in mind, you can start to see the message that the koan is telling you. You can see what the koan is prompting you to do. If indeed there is a primordial Buddha, and all sentient beings are originally enlightened, and there is a non-dual relationship between oneself and that primordial Buddha, or any Buddha, then the message of the koan is that you are originally a manifestation of the primordial Buddha because you are originally enlightened and you exist in a non-dual relationship with that Buddha. Thus, your job is to meditate and to do good acts and realize that nature. You must do the meditation and the good acts to realize that nature, and then once you have realized it, because you already have it, because it's already your original nature, you must maintain it because that's what Buddhas do. One of my favorite quotes comes from Zen Master Dogen whenever he is asked, why do Buddhas or other enlightened beings continue to meditate? And his response is, well, Buddhas be Buddhas. That's what they do. That's their activity. That is what they do in this world, is meditate and do good acts and continue to polish their mirrors, so to speak. Even if you don't believe in the concept of the primordial Buddha as it's laid out in the Lotus Sutra and interpreted by the Tendai, Shingon, Pure Land, and Zen schools, since the topic is very controversial, as I said, then it still relies heavily on the idea of original enlightenment. Maybe you aren't a primordial Buddha, but you certainly are originally a Buddha, and so is every sentient being around you. And whether you arose in this world as a skillful means of enlightening unenlightened beings, as it says in the Lotus Sutra, or you arose in this world because you allowed your mirror to become dirty, as it says in some other Zen interpretations, you are here in samsara believing that you are a deluded, unenlightened samsaric sentient being, when in reality, your true and original nature is that of the Tathagata. This is a totally circular argument, but it's a beautifully circular one that sort of traps you. The argument here is that you are a Tathagata, and the way to realize that in this world is to believe that you are a Tathagata, and thus realize that in this world. Either you believe this and you realize it and become a Tathagata, or you don't believe it and you don't become a Tathagata. Because then why would you seek to become one if you don't believe that you at least have the potential, and you continue to exist then as a samsaric sentient being until you change your mind? This koan is a command, whereas the other ones we have done so far have been questions. This one is not asking you for realization. It is telling you how things are, and thus it is up to you to realize it. The other ones, though they are questions, are not meant to be answered in the strictest sense, but they do not tell you to do something. Telling us to do something relies on an assumption that the thing it's asking us to do is possible, and that we believe we can do it. Therefore, the command is for you, the practitioner, to take the leap of faith and believe that you are a Buddha, and that you are capable of realizing as such, and then realize it. Now, it's important to note that the way that one does this realization differs between different schools of Buddhism. If you remember earlier when we read what Dogen writes as a commentary to this koan, he says, cease practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words, and following after speech. That should be of interest to you because koans are inherently speech-driven. They are inherently language-driven and words-driven. And he's saying to cease practice based on any sort of words or language or understanding of words or language, and instead to learn the backward step, the anti-intellectual step, that turns your light inward to yourself and illuminates what is within. Thus, body and mind of themselves, these delusions that we have, imagining we have a body and that we have a mind, will drop away and your original face will be manifest. Thus, he's arguing that this is an entirely unintellectual, non-discursive, non-categorical understanding, and that words, language, and speech are totally insufficient and totally counter and contradictory to realizing that understanding. Daito doesn't take nearly as much of an anti-intellectual or anti-linguistic perspective on this when he says, sweep away your thoughts means one must do zazen. Once thoughts are quieted, the original face appears. This instead relies on a much more neutral or middle way interpretation of the koan, which is that you just need to get out of your own way. You need to stop having thoughts and getting carried away by those thoughts and getting tied up in them and believing that you are a person having them. And once you do that, you can clear away the fogging of a mirror. Thoughts are like the fogging of a mirror, and when you wipe away all condensation, a mirror reflects clearly, he writes. Quiet your thoughts and behold your original face before you were born. This does also argue that when you were born, meaning when you arose in this world, you originally were completely free of all these things, relating to what I said earlier about the Zen interpretation being that you arise in this world a perfectly clean mirror reflecting all of reality exactly as it is, and then your own thoughts, your own delusions, and your own karma get in the way of that, and you lose that clarity. and thus you have to practice and meditate and polish the mirror again in order to regain that sort of enlightenment. Mumon's comments on this, or Wu Men, are that you cannot describe it or draw it. You cannot praise it enough or perceive it. No place can be found in which you put the original face. It will not disappear even when the universe is destroyed. So he's arguing, just like Dogen, that this is something that cannot be understood intellectually, and it cannot be understood with language and words or with images even. And you cannot praise it enough so that you might get it. And you can't perceive it because it's an extrasensory or unsensory kind of experience. There's nowhere to hide it, and it will not disappear even when the universe is destroyed. You can't hide it because that assumes that it's ever in a state where it cannot be seen to the enlightened beings of the world. And thus, it also endures even when the universe is annihilated or destroyed. And the reason that it endures like that, seemingly violating the rule of impermanence, is that the existence of the mirror itself is a reflection of diamond-hard enlightenment, or diamond-hard concentration, or diamond-hard resolution, diamond-hard wisdom that cannot be violated by anything else. The mirror stays, but the dirt or the fog or anything that gets in the way of it reflecting reality exactly as it is transient and transitory. It will be wiped away at some point, and it's just a matter of if you do it right now or if you do it sometime later. Maybe you don't believe that you can do it. Maybe you don't believe the mirror is there. Maybe you have no reason to believe that if you do this practice, it will work, and so you don't do it now. But if you take that leap of faith, and if eventually you change your mind, then you just do it later. That's why I said that it was a circular argument, because no matter what happens, you do eventually polish the mirror, and you do eventually realize your original face. It's just a matter of if you think that you can now, and so you do it now, or eventually later on, you clear up your schedule, you cancel lunch tomorrow, you cancel that meeting on Thursday afternoon, and then you just go ahead and do it. This has been an analysis of the original face koan. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Wright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.